Farming food and fashion for a discerning world is serious business in Aotearoa, New Zealand. There are new opportunities everywhere just waiting for the open-minded. Sarah's Country shines a light on the matters that matter most. And here's your host, Sarah Perriam.
Kia ora and welcome to Sarah's Country. This is your home to tune in to the diversity of challenges facing farming, food and fashion here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And there is also a diversity of ideas and thoughts on the solutions to our challenges. I'm your host, Sarah Perriam, and you are listening to this week's Opinion Maker, where this week we're going to deep dive into the Climate Change Commission's recommendations for 300,000 hectares of New Zealand to be planted in new native forests over the next 15 years. It is positive news to our pastoral landowners who have been crying for more focus on native versus exotic trees. But the goal to plant more native trees is, of course, welcomed whilst we mop up the carbon from our atmosphere quicker through pine plantations. There is longer term effects on not planting the right trees in the right place and maybe worse off from an ecological perspective as well. Scientists are leading work to help provide a better understanding of how native trees can be integrated and have described exotic forests as a game with one hand tied behind our backs. Today on the show for you, we have a lineup of 3 New Zealand farmers and conservationists that have been actively working in their parts of the country, choosing to plant their properties and recreational areas in natives for the long term over the financially incentivised carbon credits of exotic pines. There's an incredible lineup of guests providing some ideas and thought-provoking solutions on what is a hotly contested debate. And how do we see the wood from the trees and what is effectively very different systems, a monocultured pine plantation over a native tree forest which has long biological benefits into the future? Well, it's all sparked from a recent Farmers Weekly article that Richard Rennie did back in February, which saw Scion scientists Steve Wakelin and Dr. Tim Payne's acknowledgement that native afforestation remains a relatively new and uncertain game, and some sacrifices in how much carbon is absorbed when opting for natives in the short term. The additional environmental and biodiversity benefits of this focus is well worth it. Following that story, Rakaia-based crop and sheep farmer Andrew Luddington pen to paper in a pulpit to say that he very much agreed with Steve and Tim on their piece and wrote in to discuss the considerable cost of planting natives becomes a barrier for achieving 300,000 hectares, of which the Commission has suggested the target to be. There is also a negative effect of the investment per hectare of exotics under the emissions trading scheme and the huge difference in sequestration rates being the only metric we have on the table. He also said the exotic creep of wilding pines could discourage landowners from dealing with the pest. Well, Andrew Luddington's going to join us first in studio to set the scene on also what I found fascinating is the negative consequences that he saw when he was working in the UK under the Common Agricultural Policy at the time, and how he was involved in investors taking advantage to the detriment of the intent. And this was around the planting of the likes of linseed and flax, and what the UK have since learned in funding biodiversity. Andrew will set the scene for the rest of the show. And following Andrew's discussion, we're going to continue to learn more about the work that's happening on the Banks Peninsula and the learnings that have created an initiative called Forever Forest. 190 hectares of beautiful native bush has been protected forever to naturally regenerate. Adrian Loo has just completed his Masters and is a fan of all forestry types. He is the forest manager to explain Forever Forests with us coming up in studio and how they partner with landowners to restore forest ecosystems in sensitive environmental areas within New Zealand. Adrian is a very practical young gentleman who understands the opportunity cost of taking farmland out of production and how the farmer can effectively be incentivised in multiple different ways. Really enjoyed my conversation with Adrian coming up in this Opinion Maker. And to close the show, our panel today is a discussion with an environmental consultant from the Agribusiness Group, Mander, who works closely with farming clients on their projects to develop sustainable land use options, including carbon farming, and his thoughts on how to drive incentive into native forests on our high country. Sam will illustrate the work that he's seeing on farm, along with Cambridge farmer Ian Brennan, who is a trustee in what is known as the Tane Tree Trust. Ian comes to it with a great lens coming into the industry and has chosen to plant out 30% of his dry stock farm. Ian also features in a recent documentary that is now on TVNZ On Demand, released last Thursday and funded by Pure Advantage, which is a group of New Zealand philanthropists funding natural projects within New Zealand. The documentary is called O Tātou Nei Hiri, Our Forest, and it's a major investigation into the opportunities and challenges for native forest and the rapid work that will need to be done to achieve the Climate Change Commission's targets. Wow, it is a full-on show, and always we like to go as deep as we can into the issues facing the New Zealand primary sector, and one that I know that landowners across the country are grappling with, the 1.2 million hectares of native trees that are currently on our landscape, and the desire for more. However, the financial benefits, the financial barriers are there that are hindering achieving such ambitious goals, in particular with an international ETS that may not be fit for purpose here in New Zealand. First up, here on Sarah's Country, Andrew Luddington in studio.
This is Sarah's Country. Join the conversation. Have thoughts on an interview? Or have you got questions you want answered by a future guest? Let us know. Email sarah@sarahscountry.com.
One of the first things you learn when you live out here
is where to shop for the things you need to live out here.
like electric fencing,
or horse feed,
or bee suits.
children,
chook food.
Do you want a couple of these?
Or something stylish to wear. Not everyone's got stuff like this.
But at Farmlands we do, and then some.
So if you need anything to help your farm,
Grow, milk, drench,
Rakaia, come on in.
because we're out here too.
Well, the Climate Change Commissioner's report adopts the emissions trading scheme's look-up table assumption that a hectare of new native forests of any type will absorb about 6.5 tonnes of carbon dioxide every year over 50 years, compared to the average exotic plant plantation soaking 34 tonnes a hectare every year over 30 years. And the Commission also estimates there is 740,000 hectares of marginal land unsuitable for commercial forestry that could be allowed to regenerate naturally. So it's a little bit of a catch-22, and so why have we not put native trees as part of a priority for our policy in our going forward of our climate change? There's also some caveats to spreading the native story, and I'm joined in studio now by Rakaia crop and sheep farmer Andrew Luddington, who's also put pen to paper in this pulpit following the Science scientists' focus around how the native trees will come with some caveats. You have done some great numbers around the sequestration rates between the difference between native trees and radiata pine. Where do you fear monoculture has been incentivised, and how do we bring native trees back as a priority into this conversation?
What has happened here is that we've concentrated on the carbon sequestration of exotic trees, particularly radiata pine, because they do it faster than any other tree in New Zealand. And of course, that has an economic consequence. More and more people will be wanting to grow more and more radiata pine because there's simply more money in it. With native trees, there is a lot less sequestration over that period of time, so people will not want to do it or even take out native trees and replace them with radiata pine.
And so when it comes to, I enjoyed in your pulpit, before we get into the work that you have been doing, Andrew, with Hanawai Reserve as well as your own property, you are concerned around the incentivisation of wilding pines in the high country and landowners not wanting to touch them because they potentially also could be a source of revenue.
That's absolutely right. Currently, radiata pine are considered a major weed in areas like Canterbury and down in Otago, central Otago there, and it is very hard to control them. They grow like lupins. It's quite amazing. But of course, if you're then looking at establishing radiata pine, which has a cost, it then may make economic sense to just leave those weed pine growing because you might be able to claim carbon out of them. And that way the trees will then dominate the area and leave very little to grow there. So effectively you are creating a monoculture, almost a green desert of radiata pine.
An interesting term, a green desert. And carbon credit farming is something that has been a flow-on negative effect. Monoculture is one of them, but it's something that you've experienced in the UK with the Common Agricultural Policy and the flow-on particularly around guiding land use. And I want to get into that, but firstly, like to understand the considerable work you've done, firstly on your own property and then with the restoration project here on the Banks Peninsula.
Yes, thank you. On my own property, I will have two, and I plant quite a lot of trees on each one. These trees are specific to the nature of the property, which is quite important with your natives. I do about 500 trees now on both properties, and I like to extend that. All in, I think I've planted about 10,000 trees between the both of them. I also work currently now with the Summit Road Society, looking after trees up on our lovely Port Hills. I am a supporter of the Hanawai Reserve, but just financially. And I also did 4.5 years as a warden on Quail Island, looking after those trees there. And every now and again, a neighbouring farmer may want some trees planted. I get a group together and I'll turn up and do it for nothing, a good day's work.
Absolutely, and some fantastic volunteer hours by many as well. Thank you so much for the work you do. The cost is considerable and not incentivised. Why not?
The cost of planting a native tree is quite a lot. You have to buy the tree, and it is a struggle to get them established. It takes some doing. They grow slowly, so you have a big weed problem. It's a bit of a shock when they go straight into the ground. So to buy a native tree is about $3.50 to $4, so that sort of area. I've never bought a native pine. I don't think I will, but I imagine it's a lot cheaper, and they will grow straight away. And I think the native trees need to be planted quite close. They like shelter from each other to help each other grow upwards. So you have to have a fairly high density.
So why are we concerned if it is the fast acting carbon sponge of pines that can do, a role for us to meet our Paris Agreement? Why would we not go down this? What are those flow-on effects that you are most concerned about that is more holistic than just number crunching?
That's right. I think if we were just looking at carbon being locked up, then the radiata pine would really do it. But of course, what that's going to do is create this monoculture. There will just be radiata pine at the expense of everything else. And when you start growing the same thing all the time, too often in too many places, you start getting problems. For instance, potato blight destroyed potatoes in Ireland. If we just have nothing but radiata pine, something is going to turn up and take out that radiata pine. So that is one major concern. But I think the problems that we have are a much more holistic one. We are according to some people, in a mass extinction event, which is purely human-led. And what we're doing with just native pine in New Zealand is to take out a lot of our own fauna and flora.
And knowledge is something that's really lacking in the harvesting of native seedlings, raising and planting and establishing and looking after as well. Is there any good work that you're seeing on the ground that we need to get in behind and encourage and provide more grants to support the work that you're doing?
Yes, it is difficult, but there are plenty of seeds about that you can find here and there with your native pine, particularly flaxes. How you actually get to grow them from seed is something I've not done. I've just gone to a nursery and bought trees at the right height. But a lot of people on the Summit Road Society to reintroduce natives will scatter seed all over the place. We had a great day doing that with flax. And yes, it was all good fun and can be done that way with some results to be seen now.
And so therefore the 2.5 hectares of natives that you have planted on your Rakaia property, you are doing that financially off your own back, and there is no way of proving yet around the sequestration rates that could be applied to offset your emissions on your farm. That must be frustrating.
I'm not frustrated about it. I enjoy it. I do it because I like it. I like to see this diversity, and I can afford it, which is quite lucky. But yes, it is very expensive, and to look after it in the first 5 years before you get canopy closure does take an awful lot of effort. And if there's a drought, I stand there with a hose pipe for about 30 seconds per tree. I mean, it is absolutely deathly, but I do enjoy it. It's quite good fun. I did get a small grant this time round for buying some trees, which came to about a third of the cost of 500 trees that I bought last year. That is the first time I've had a grant. But the cost to me to get native plants established is about $20,000 to $25,000 per hectare. It is a lot.
And when we caught up to discuss this interview, Andrew, I was so intrigued around your background prior to coming to New Zealand and your involvement in the UK, seeing the unintended consequences of government policy, particularly the Common Agricultural Policy, and your involvement in linseed. Can you sort of see what market, tell us and illustrate for us that journey and how a whole market was built to take advantage of government policy when it wasn't thought through properly?
That's right. I got a call from a friend of mine I used to work for when I was a student, and he said, we need to set up a company, I have a business plan. And what had happened with the Common Agricultural Policy was to take agricultural support, away from price fixing to direct payment to farmers for producing crops. And the reason partly of that was to control the amount of crop production in Europe, to prevent intervention storage and stuff like that, milk lakes, butter mountains, what have you. And they did this with a thing called set-aside. So at the time we started farming, if we had 100 hectares of crop, you had to have 15 hectares in addition as set-aside, otherwise you wouldn't get paid. And some of these crops had relatively low area payments, and some of them had fairly high area payments. Now, linseed, which is a low-yielding and relatively low-value crop, had the highest area payment of all at 240 UK pounds per acre. So that would be a couple of $1,000s per hectare, which became seriously attractive, and linseed was very cheap to grow. So we cottoned onto that very quickly and rented land and grew a lot of linseed all over Britain. And we did very well out of it indeed. Then that changed, and we went on to flax with a similar system. And then the system changed again as the European community realized that quite a lot of farmers are getting unnecessarily rich, particularly big corporate ones. So they decided to change it again and have these area payments, not just relating to set aside to control the amount that we grew, but also to create environmental beneficial aspects to agriculture all over Europe. And that is now very strong. You get paid for beetle banks, for variety of cropping and all sorts of different things, chemistry being kept away from water courses, all sorts of stuff like that is now going on. Planting trees everywhere, bird landing banks, whatever. There are hundreds of different environmental things that you can do in Europe now.
So it was an unintended consequence of incentivising land use change that they saw was, getting, as you said, corporate farmers were getting rich off it. The way the UK is incentivised now to be able to basically set aside and shut down pastoral farming in most of the UK is also having a detrimental effect. But at the same time, it's ticking all of their biological goals that they're trying to achieve.
Yes.
So why wouldn't New Zealand bring that in? Why would incentivising native tree planting, the shutting off of native tree in land that's unproductive, the 740,000 hectares the Climate Change Commission has identified that could potentially go into natives, why not put money into that?
Well, I really do wish they would. And the English scheme is to plant native English trees, particularly oaks and sycamores and ash and stuff like that. And I'd like to see the same over here. I've got a little plantation of macrocarpa trees on my farm, which I'm taking out for firewood, and I would like to replant that in totara. I think totara would grow really well there, but I would like to plant that for plantation for eventual use as totara for fine timber, whatever that might be. The cost would be enormous, and I would never get my money back in my lifetime, but somebody might, and that would be really good to grow it for its intended purpose.
How do you find the New Zealand government's long-term strategy as opposed to ticking a very short-term box with our Paris Agreement?
I found as an immigrant here myself, I found dealing with the New Zealand government actually very pleasant and very easy and very open. I do like that. But at the moment, for any of these applications for grants for trees, there just isn't really a lot about. I think it'll be coming, and I think it'll be changing, and that will be really good. So I think, we could push for an awful lot more, and I think an awful lot more will eventually be coming.
Okay, so therefore my last question to you is, at a sequestration rate difference between 6.5 tonnes per hectare for natives versus 35 tonnes per hectare for exotic pine plantations, how do we achieve a balance of both, sequestering carbon at a fast rate that we need to do, yet at the same time have a long-term approach?
That's right. So what you do there is your radiata pine will be producing, say, if the price goes up to $100 per hectare for simplicity, at 35 tonnes per hectare, you've got $35,000 per hectare to deal with, whereas your natives are only going to be producing 6.5 times 100. But of course, what you need to do there, I think, is to define the quality of those natives. It's not just carbon they're producing. They're producing a wildlife reserve, basically a place for much more native animals to live in, to create balance, to prevent this decline of wildlife around the world. And I think that's so much more important. So it's quite easily done by just saying, okay, well, your radiata pine, that might be worth a certain amount, but your natives should be worth so much more to bring it into parity.
Yes, and do you believe that could be done by a make-up of an emissions trading scheme to the same sequestration rate for natives and a top-up from the government to support the development of more native tree reserves? Quite
possibly. The trouble is the emissions trading scheme is an international scheme that might suit people who are the lawmakers in their own countries, a bit like England, in Europe, saying, we're only going to speak English. That's not going to go down well in France, and so on. So I was wondering whether the emissions trading scheme for New Zealand is actually a viable option at all. I wonder whether we should produce an emissions trading scheme in New Zealand that is specific to New Zealand. We have more solar radiation than just about anywhere else on the world, and we can really grow trees very quickly. We've also got a lot of rain. I've learned from the emissions trading scheme that natives that are under 5 metres tall, which is an awful lot of our trees and shrubs, aren't actually eligible. They still sequester carbon, they're just a little bit shorter. I think we should put them in.
So we need to look out for the little guys. It's not all about what can shoot to the top the fastest within the forest.
Exactly.
Andrew, it's been an absolute pleasure having you in the studio today. Thank you so much for your insight, your experience and knowledge that you've brought here to New Zealand, and the hard work that you're doing both on your own property and of course the Summit Road Reserve as well, with all of those amazing volunteers on the Port Hills here in Canterbury. It's really inspirational, and it really has set the scene for this particular show, the Serious Country Opinion Maker. After the break, we're going to continue to stay on the Banks Peninsula and speak to Adrian Loo, who is the forest manager for an initiative called Forever Forests. And we'll talk a little bit more with Adrian around the Forever Forest concept, and following on with what Andrew said about the Hinawai Reserve, which is truly inspirational. Forever Forests works with landowners to deal with sensitive environmental areas within New Zealand, and how we can achieve a balance of both pastoral farming and, of course, regeneration of our native bush. All that up here on Sarah's Country.
This is Sarah's Country. Catch the latest on the matters that matter most wherever you are. Listen to Sarah's Country on Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple or Google Podcasts. Try asking Alexa or Siri. Play Sarah's Country on podcast.
We have in New Zealand some of the most amazing, wonderful timber trees of the world. We suddenly discovered a lot of people were thinking about this possibility. Why not manage native forests for all of their values?
What we're trying to do is find that sweet spot between, you've got the farmers that are interested in growing grass, and you've got the exotic foresters that's growing trees for timber. We feel that there's a role there for natives, and they can be integrated with the land uses, and they can actually enhance them. They don't have to be competing with them.
The light bulb went on, and I thought, you're spending all this money and effort turning what was productive land, and you're giving it back to nature and making something sustainable for the future.
You're not mining the natural capital, but actually regenerating it.
Continuous cover forestry, that's what I'm trying to set up here, a forest that can be managed for a sustainable, forever supply of timber. Because it's a valuable resource, people will manage it and look after it, and part of looking after it is making sure it's healthy.
What I like about Cassie's farm, it has the best of both worlds, it has all the native bush up there, but it also is a viable farm.
So when we restore a forest, we're not just planting trees and welcoming birds back. We are restoring the connection to enable everything that belongs there to thrive.
Continuing on in Serious Country's Opinion Maker, where the theme is around how to get our native tree policy right here in New Zealand. We don't seem to be able to, excuse the pun, see the wood for the trees, and how exotic pine plantation policies and our obligations under the Paris Accord in the emissions trading scheme here are so different from the large biodiversity outcomes that we can achieve from planting natives over exotic forests. I'm joined in studio now by Forever Forests forest manager Adrian Loo. Adrian, thank you so much for coming into the studio.
Thank you for inviting me on the show.
It's great because obviously you're not very far away, overseeing work in the Hinawai Reserve, and Forever Forest is based here in Canterbury. Could you give us a bit of an understanding what is the initiative behind Forever Forests and how it came about?
Yeah, so I'm traditionally, well, I still am based working in the forestry industry as well as native, so I like, probably a bit guilty, I like all types of trees, natives and exotic. So I grew up riding my mountain bike in all different forests, so I just like forests in general, sort of where the Forever Forest model came from. But Forever Forest focuses on native forests and permanent native forests. So it's about partnering with landowners and enabling them to increase the area of native on their farm in a way which works with the current farming system and also creates a income for the farm, because a lot of people are doing things which are really nice off their own back, and like Hawaii Reserve is an example of that, and I've talked to Hugh and seen the examples of what he's doing over there. But there's a similar project we're working on in Banks Peninsula where, yes, doing the right thing plays part of it, but it's also good to be able to have a sustainable income for that property as opposed to the income from farming currently.
So the big question is how?
How? Yeah, that is a really good question.
How to achieve a sustainable revenue stream from something that a lot of people are doing, as you said, through their own philanthropy.
Yeah, I guess I've done a little bit of work on afforestation in general recently. I completed a master's, and a big component of that was looking at what are the barriers and drivers of planting all types of trees. And when you start looking at the drivers for planting trees, they came down to non-financial drivers that had environmental benefits and drivers which created advantages to the farming system as a whole. So that screams native to me. It's not carbon isn't a driver. It's not future for future harvest revenue. It's not to create this big forest asset, but it's for something that does good for the farm, looks nice, non-financial, and helps the environment, which is cool. Then when I looked at the barriers to those tree plantings, there were two main barriers, and one was opportunity cost. So it means if you're taking part of your farm out of your farming system and putting it into, say, native, you need to have a balanced income stream or balanced benefit to the farming system from both land use choices. And the second was the financial barrier to undertaking the activity. So do you have the capital to go spend $15,000 to $20,000 a hectare planting natives? And if not, what incentives are available from the government? Things like the 1 Billion Trees program, which is just finishing this year. They had incentives for native planting. I think there was just under 13,000 hectares across New Zealand of native afforestation that was funded through that program, which is awesome, really awesome.
But it's a long way off. 300,000 in
a really
15
long way off.
years.
Yeah. So to me, that screams that if you want to promote landowners to take some of that 1.1 to 1.4 million hectares that the Climate Change Commission identified as marginal land and dedicate it to native bush to overcome that financial barrier, it's got to be bigger incentives. So.
And let's talk about that, because you identified something that is very strong, a part of the New Zealand Farm Environment Trust National Awards last Thursday, and every single one of those regional supreme winners, there was one that was 125 hectares they had put in QE2 Trust. That's of awesome. Native bush. It's just effectively part of those farmers' DNA, but also the ecological benefits to the farming operation. What are some examples when you were doing your masters that you've seen that flow-on effect? I mean, water quality must certainly be one of them.
Water quality is huge, and so is just soil stabilisation, erosion-prone land. And that biodiversity thing is a really interesting point, because it's something which it's a non-financial benefit which isn't recognised properly right now, I don't think. When we look at if I'm looking at a piece of land and I'm talking with a farmer about what the long-term opportunity costs and how to build this into your farming system, quite often what is it going to earn per hectare per year is a common question that comes up. And unfortunately, under the current ETS settings, when you start comparing natives with exotics, there's just such a huge difference in earning potential, which is why I think we're seeing, people kind of stray towards the exotic side rather than really push this native component. And I think it's important to realise we need both. Climate Change Commission, it was 300,000 hectares of native and 380,000 hectares of exotic, and it's all about the right tree in the right place. But if we want to increase the native forest area, we need to figure out a way that under the ETS or under some sort of recognition of the non-financial benefits to the land, how do we reward the landowner for that? So that would be a government policy tool, but no idea how it could be implemented or.
Sounds like you need to be in a position of advising. It's such a great balance to have your passion for all trees as part of this discussion. How can you establish natives and exotics to work together in harmony within a property when you do have that eventual harvesting component with pine plantations to take into account roading, access, those types of things?
Yeah, so it's more traditionally you'd say put your exotic trees on your most marginal land, your steepest, hardest to access, and kind of learning from the mistakes of people that have done that before, we end up with woodlots which are very hard to harvest, high extraction costs, high eroding costs, high soil erosion risks in certain areas. So it's about looking at a property as a whole and saying, these areas here, we don't want to put tracks in, we don't want to be harvesting it. That should be a permanent forest, whether it be exotic planted forest, which is long-term converted to native, or it's just a native, like the sides of waterways is a classic. Under the National Environmental Standard for Plantation Forestry, we already set setbacks off these waterways, but why not double or triple them and have a nice, really big riparian zone of native bush, great biodiversity, great water quality, soil stabilisation, you're not putting any sediment near the water, and then keep those exotic forests on the areas which are low impact, easy to harvest, probably going to be more profitable, and don't carry the same risks as steep land. And
another thing that I've been trying, as you hear a glimpse on national radio, and I wished I'd listened to who the scientists were, but I know it was based here in Lincoln University. You might be able to help me. But they talked about native trees being planted in pine plantations as fire breaks as another opportunity. I look at Port Hills. We've already had that experience. And I personally wouldn't go and build in that area for fear of what we've seen at Lake Ohau as well. How have you seen the integration of natives also be there for those types of things too?
Yeah, so plantation forests naturally have a lot of native forest within them. I think they say roughly 10% of every plantation forest is native bush. It's not traditionally planted as fire breaks as such, because you'd run into troubles of then having to clear parts of it to move through the stand as you harvest, which would be quite unfortunate. It would be far better to take the concentrated areas of native and protect and enhance and try and grow those throughout successive cycles. Fire's a tricky one though, because as we experience global warming, climate change, the frequency of these, not just fire but adverse weather events, is predicted to increase. So when you start looking at soil erosion or fire or big storms, we've got to start planning for how to protect our land against these. And I think that extends to even looking outside of plantation forests and just looking at farms in general, even farms which aren't wanting to put plantation trees on them, and saying, look at these waterways that you've got here that bear soil next to them. Why don't we start getting some forest cover and start protecting these? And then the next question is, well, how can we do that? What funding's available? What's the long-term benefit to the property?
Oh, you've nailed it. Funding. That is a huge part of the barrier, financial barrier, and Forever Forests works collectively with landowners. But how and what grants and funding is available now, and your opinion on what more needs to be done?
If you look at the Billion Trees program, they were offering $4,000 a hectare. And there was for native planting, there's an erosion top up $500 a hectare and fencing top up $500 a hectare. But it's a long cry from the sort of $10,000 to $20,000 which is estimated to plant these native forests. So we've got landowners which really want to plant native bush, and they look at these big areas, and then you do the numbers and you say, well, have you got $200,000 to throw at this? And not a lot of people have that sitting in their back pocket for
no financial return.
With low financial return. So what Forever Forests, our goal is to get emitters to recognise the value of these native forests. So we brand the native carbon credits through, we've got videos and photos and stuff which is tangible, and an emitter can point at a property and say, I'm supporting this property and it's native bush. And in response, we're requesting a premium for the carbon credits from that forest. The premium, in the market, we've traditionally seen premiums of up to 25% for native carbon credits. But just as a point of comparison, 1 hectare of native forest over a 50-year period will on average at current prices, give a landowner $250 per hectare per year. Whereas if we look at radiata pine, and this is using Canterbury lookup tables, so it's probably underestimating the true return, it's going to give you about $750 a hectare a year. So we don't want, if we want parity, we don't want a 25% premium for native carbon credits. If you truly want to support native forests in New Zealand, you're going to need a 2 to 3 times multiplier to really recognise how amazing these native forests are and why we should increase the area of them.
And so the big question is when can farmers with their own emitters within their own certificate of title that they're planting these trees actually be allowed to bring this into their number, knowing their number, and at first helping offset their pastoral land emissions before the big corporates internationally can come in and buy up and offset without them actually doing anything to reduce.
Absolutely, and I think it's just an opportunity thing. So almost every farmer that I've talked to in my job has areas of post-89 eligible reverting native bush. It's just about getting it registered into the ETS, which is no easy task, and then claiming the credits for those. And then once you've claimed the credits, you can choose whether you sell them or you hold on to them to offset your own farm emissions. But it's just about, I think Beef and Lamb did a report recently which highlighted a whole heap of land, and I know there's been a little bit of debate about the accuracy, but what that really highlighted is, hey guys, there's a whole heap of native forests on your properties which is currently sequestering carbon, and some of it's going to be eligible for the ETS. So why not get it in the system and start offsetting your own emissions?
Could you give us some advice about how you'd go about navigating that? Do you need the support of the likes of consultants to do that for you? Is it straightforward?
There's a lot of good resources on MPI's website. It outlines the difference between pre-90, post-89 forest land, what's currently considered forest cover. But yeah, it is a complex task, and if you engage someone like myself or Forever Forests to undertake that for you, it does make your life a little bit easier, less headaches. Typically we see there's a lot of roadblocks to getting into the system. You've got to be quite good at GIS mapping, you've got to have access to historical imagery going back to before the 90s, and then you've got to navigate the carbon accounting complexities, because we're talking about a government-run system that's tightly bound by legislation and regulation, which is even now changing through consultation. So it's a quick-moving beast, which if you get it wrong, there's quite harsh penalties. So it's good to ask for advice, and someone like me more than willing to pick up the phone, have a chat for 10, 15, 20 minutes, just talk about all the different options, and then make your own decision if you want to go down that route or you want to carry on talking. And
thank God for Forever Forest and the work you do. It's so helpful to navigate this, because there is so many things as landowners in New Zealand to try and navigate, and this is certainly one that I know New Zealand farmers are incredibly passionate about. But all they see is that big black hole to pour money into for low financial return, and think, how am I ever going to actually have this advantageous of what's coming down, particularly bringing agriculture into the ETS as well. So it's fantastic. What are some of the companies that you're working, the emitters you explained that you're working with, that are looking to pour money into the sector?
So traditionally the people, which I've probably this is an observation thing, that are more willing to pay the premium are retail emitters. Because they've got a story to tell. And when you start getting into, say, the big large scale emitters like your say energy companies, for example, the volume of units that they need is just so huge that when you start adding, imagine if I turned up to a large emitter and said, can we double or triple your cost overnight, or even add 25%? Like, I'm sure the branding and marketing team would love it, but as soon as it hit the financial team, it's going to stick with the status. So it's about people who want to make a change, and they want to be able to support the type of forest that they like. So, and I think the retail space is really cool. So one of the cool projects we did was we made Tora Bombora, which is a music festival in Wellington. So they wanted to be carbon neutral this year. So they became carbon neutral. Actually, we called it carbon positive. I'm not sure that's the right phrase, but it means that they offset more than what they emitted during the festival. So every party goer there knew that they were creating good for the environment as opposed to bad, which is really cool. And also fashion being one of the largest emitters of
carbon in the world as well. They've got such a unique story to be able to tell through that as well, and sourcing the product from the place they can offset it at the same time.
And there's some cool work being done in that space. There's a startup company based out of Auckland called Carbon Click, and they're an online store plugin. So when you check out from purchasing whatever new shoes you want, or you can click offset my emissions and it'll build in the cost of your emissions to that. And they are dedicated to offsetting using New Zealand native forest carbon credits. So, yeah, it's really cool to see stuff happening in this space, but it's still very early days, isn't it?
And channeling that money back to New Zealand farmers to be able to access to put that in permanent forests, so that they know that they've got longevity for the generations to come. Thank you so much, Adrian. I hope that your phone runs even more hotter since hearing about this on Serious Country. Please share this interview with Adrian as well amongst your circles, because there's certainly some great things happening and when we do uncover them here. In the Serious Country Opinion Maker, we're going to continue on after the break with our panel with Cambridge farmer Ian Brennan and Agribusiness Group's consultant Sam Mander, that Adrian, I understand, does some close work with, from both their perspectives on this native tree policy going forward, and potentially how we can bring in biodiversity credits. All that up next here on Serious Country.
This is Sarah's Country. Join the conversation. Have thoughts on an interview? Or have you got questions you want answered by a future guest? Let us know. Email sarah@sarahscountry.com.
Introducing the Banks Peninsula Forever Forest. 190 hectares of reverting native bush, focusing on natural regeneration of native vegetation. This property focuses on a strategy of minimal interference. Just like Hinawai, we allow natural succession to run its course towards a vegetation cover, similar to that prevailing before the forest clearance by human settlers. Forever Forests, protecting forests forever.
Well, to round out Sarah's Country's Opinion Maker, focusing on a rethink to our native tree policy here in New Zealand, we're joined on our panel by a farmer from Cambridge involved in a new initiative that was launched last week. It is called Ota. Oh my goodness, my apologies. I'm going to do that again. I absolutely just had a blind blank. Otato Ngā Hiri. My apologies. Well, rounding out Sarah's Country's Opinion Maker this week, focusing on our native tree policy here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We're rounding out with our panel. We have both a farmer and a consultant who work daily on around an integration between how native tree forestry and pastoral farming can work together in both of the areas that they are working in. Cambridge farmer Ian Brennan is a trustee on Tane, a tree trust that has launched a new project thanks to the team at Pure Advantage called Otato Ngā Hiri, meaning our forest. And it's a major investigation into the opportunities and challenges that is facing our native forests. They're calling for radical change to be able to meet the Climate Change Commission's targets of 300,000 hectares of new native forest by 2035. Also on the panel is environmental consultant from the Agribusiness Group, Sam Mander, who works closely with farming clients on projects to develop sustainable land use options, has a farm environment planning auditor certification, working also in carbon farming and greenhouse gas management. Thank you so much to both Ian and Sam for taking the time to join us on the panel. Sam, I'll kick off with yourself before we understand more around the Tane Tree Trust and the work that Otato Ngā Hiri is doing with Ian. Sam, could you outline a little bit about what your day-to-day job is involved with New Zealand farmers around the country?
Sure thing. No, thanks, Sarah. It's good to be on your show. Hey, so in relation to the carbon farming and forestry stuff, the work that we're doing has mainly been specifically with hill country farmers that are wanting to understand the opportunities with carbon, which is only in forestry at the moment with the emissions trading scheme. So typically we would go on farm and assess firstly what are the options and the opportunities that they have as present, which is typically with like regenerating natives or other exotic forestry that they've planted. And then from there we would do more of a land use assessment in terms of what are the potential options going forward with carbon forestry and how they can integrate that into their farm plan. So it's sort of like a two-step process at the moment.
And Ian Brennan, tell us about your journey into planting native forests within your property and the makeup that you've chosen to plant in terms of species and how you and your wife, Trish, have gone about it.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, basically when I realised how much of this farm is land that's too steep for cattle, I decided that forestry was the best, or forest was the best thing to cover the land with. And personally, I'm really only interested in native forestry. I mean, I did consider planting pines in some of the gullies where there was a big enough block to make it a viable concern, minimum 3 hectares. But I always wanted to plant natives because I thought it would be a cool thing to do, basically. That's how I started. And so I started by every winter we would plant just what we could afford, which was usually like 1,500 to 2,000 plants. And every year we'd do the worst areas. And then eventually I came upon the Tane Tree Trust and I met people who taught me a heck of a lot more about the potential for natives. And I started aiming towards trying to set up something a bit bigger than that here. So, it's a process that's evolved as I met people who could help me along the way.
Tell us a little bit more about the Tane Tree Trust and O Tātou Ngā Hiri, our forest, which is being, supported by our largest philanthropist, Sir Stephen Tyndall and Pure Advantage. How did you become more involved in this initiative that was launched last Thursday?
Okay. Well, my understanding is that it's an initiative launched by Pure Advantage, of which Tane Tree Trust are a part. So I've been pleasantly surprised and enlightened by reading a lot of the articles that are on the Pure Advantage website from people that I've only vaguely been aware of up until now. As for my personal involvement, as a trustee of Tane Tree Trust, I guess we're all in the position of being asked to speak at some point, but it's a charitable trust. It's not, it's not a corporation, so no one person can really say they're speaking for the trust. In my case, I always feel like I'm just giving my opinion, and I'm not trying to put out a disclaimer here. I'm just trying to clarify the situation. Pure Advantage, we're making a video on Tane Tree Trust to highlight the work that we do. And it happened that they based it at our AGM, which was held on our farm. And as these sorts of interviews and documentaries go, you interview a lot of people, and then back in the studio in post-production, you put it together by weaving a story out of the snippets that you've got. And they decided to make me and my farm the thread of the story. So that's how I got involved in it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And O Tātou Ngā Hiri is the short film and documentary that will be hosted on TVNZ's On Demand. You can go and check that out. Sam, it's a huge goal to plant 300,000 hectares of new native forest by 2035 across New Zealand. The Climate Change Commission's report has also suggested there's 740,000 hectares of gullies that could be planted in native forest. What do you believe would need to be done to help incentivise more landowners to be able to shut off some of these areas that wouldn't be so good for exotic plantations?
Sure. Look, I think we're going to need to see more support for farmers in that instance, particularly with funding and stuff. I mean, I know the way it's set up at the moment with the emissions trading scheme and what was 1 billion trees and stuff, there was a lot of option there for exotic, but to make it work with particularly new native planting, it was quite hard to meet costs. So incentivising, definitely with more funding and support, education for farmers for particularly new native plantings. But a lot of those areas are also at the regenerating stage where there's the natural seed source, and currently that's where there's really good opportunity, I think, for farmers, because you don't have the initial capital cost of getting the natives going. So it would also be good to have some recognition around those areas and how we can further establishment.
Ian, what are some of the amazing biodiversity outcomes that you've seen on your property from planting nearly a third of your property in native trees?
Just working about the farm day to day, there really isn't anywhere now that I don't see birds flying from one place to another across, wherever I'm working. There's just having small blocks of bush everywhere, one sort of planting or another. I get clouds of small birds, plus obviously tui, bellbirds, kiraroo, the odd kaka. I saw a falcon the other day. We didn't see that when we came here because there was nowhere for them to land or forage, or just no reason for them to be there, really.
And Sam, how do you believe the biodiversity outcomes can actually start to be accounted for in a wider holistic approach, as opposed to just straight rewarding of carbon credits that has been to date?
Yeah, so I think just for the farmer that with increasing natives, you're going to have the complementary benefits of more ecological values and biodiversity and stuff, which for them is going to be really integral as individuals, but also as an industry to tell the story about how they're producing their product. And biodiversity, certainly now what we're seeing, even with policy and stuff, is going to be a big part of that in the future of farming, I think. So, yeah, I guess when you have more native plantings on farm and that sort of thing, you're going to have more of that value associated with your farming entity and industry.
Ian, in all your learnings, and you've been in multiple different industries, what would your advice be to the government, to James Shaw, about how to get this policy right?
First thing is, I'd like to say I agree with what Sam has said there about we're going to have to concentrate, or we're going to have to spend a lot of time working with reversion, because it's going to be too expensive to plant all the area that they're talking about. So absolutely, Tane Street Dust would agree with that, and that's obvious once you think about it. As to the way to make this happen, we need to realise draw a line between forestry for profit and native forestry, and realise that they're not the same thing. Even if the native forest is being managed or set up to eventually be run as continuous cover forestry, you're talking about 80 years of just pure biodiversity value before you ever take anything back. So realising that those are two separate things, and trying to find a way to value native forests, such as something that's been suggested is biodiversity credits, in parallel with the emissions trading scheme and purely carbon credits, some way to recognise and pay for the values of biodiversity for farmers, to help them to make that decision to go native rather than planting exotics in every place.
Yeah, fantastic idea. Biodiversity credits. I really like that idea. Sam, would that type of thing help incentivise? Or the thing is, it's more around the speed at which it's suggested we would need to plant that amount of trees.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's a great idea, having like a premium on native credits, that sort of thing, which is, what forever forest companies like that are doing. But I think it's also important to address the other different goals that are trying to be achieved through forestry, and one of them for farmers and, the whole nation and the world is also sequestering carbon and climate change and meeting, the Paris Accord and the targets that are set by the government and that. So it's really important to look at the biodiversity, but that has been where exotics have been pushed, because they are much quicker at sequestering. So we've also been looking at, some of the research that the likes of Adam Forbes and Pure Advantage and stuff have done, which utilises a permanent exotic forest and for the short-term solution of capturing as much carbon as we can to meet those climate change targets, but then looking at it from a long-term position, using that forest as a nurse crop to then have natives coming through and being sort of more the net position of the forest in the long term. So I think that, biodiversity, climate change, like there's different things in the equation for farmers as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much both for joining us on this Opinion Maker panel focusing on our native tree policy here in New Zealand going forward. You've brought some great insight into, firstly, how it's not that straightforward. Things have to be looked at with different lenses, and the work that you're both doing on farm from a practicality perspective. I really appreciate all the hard work that you're doing. Ian Brennan and Sam Mander. Ian Brennan from Cambridge farming and part of the Tane Tree Trust as a trustee, as well as Sam Mander from Agribusiness Group, working closely with farmers on farm environment plans and carbon farming into the future and looking at those different options. Now, can I please give a shout out to the documentary that is now on TVNZ on demand called O Tātou Ngāhiri, which means our forest, thanks to the work of Pure Advantage and Tane's Tree Trust. Ian features his story with his wife Tricia on their property in Cambridge. It's certainly worth a watch, so please go and check that out. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to listen through this week's Opinion Maker on what is a hotly contested topic around, native versus exotic, or can they work collectively together to achieve our Paris Agreement targets to, soak up carbon within the atmosphere, but how can they work in conjunction with our pastoral farming systems, which is our major exporter here in New Zealand? I know personally that New Zealand landowners do have desire to plant more native forests. It's just to build a policy framework and also an incentivised system within our markets, as Adrian suggested, working with emitters, particularly in areas of brand, that are of course beneficial to the expectations around our farmers offsetting their own emissions here in New Zealand. A lot to take on board. I'd love to hear your feedback. Please send me an email, sarah@sarahscountry.com. If you've taken anything from this, I'm sure you've taken some ideas and some learnings, but also if we have missed the boat on anything in particular, let me know, because we want to ensure that we have a diversity of views here to progress the conversations that we need to have in Aotearoa New Zealand into the future. Of farming, food and fashion. It is a big game and it's a serious game, but there is certainly a lot of support around the direction that we're going as a country. I'd love your opinions on any topics that you'd like to discuss as an opinion maker, anything that is facing the sector that you're working in that we should be diving deeper into. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen. If you'd like to also be a part of the Sarah's Country Brains Trust, I have a few spaces left. We are making a foundation of members, only up to 100, to join a Facebook group to discuss the ideas that we do come up with for content within the show. So send me an email, sarah@sarahscountry.com, and I'll flick you a link to that private Facebook group. I'd love you a part of the conversation, and the group that's there already is some incredible people. So I really appreciate your time. That's all for us. We'll be back tomorrow with our Changemakers series, which has been filmed last week at the South Island Agricultural Field Days at Kirwi. Thank you so much for the nominations that have come in of who we should catch up with at the show. We did enjoy our time, and very practical on-farm solutions. Everything from measuring grass dry matter levels through to surface irrigation systems, stripline irrigation systems, and collars with cows that create virtual fencing, through to a very practical fencing implement that goes on the front of your tractor. This is not all about the apps. This is about, practical solutions on farm in our Changemaker special edition from 7 o'clock on Wednesday on Sarah's Country. I hope you can join us. Thank you so much for taking the time. Wherever you are around the world and here in Aotearoa New Zealand, take care of yourself and your loved ones. Ka kite anō.